Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar. We are going to be chatting through how to solve data protection and governance challenges with Microsoft 365. Just before I hand you over to our host, Jason, I just wanted to run through a quick few bits of housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded. A copy of the slides and the recording of the video will be sent to everyone that registered after later on this afternoon. We also have a Q&A box live as well as the chat, so please do pop questions in throughout this session because we've got a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Brilliant. Over to you, Jason.
Hi, thanks, Lisa. Hi, I'm Jason Lee. I'm the Collaboration and Information Management Lead here at Chorus. So today we're going to look at some common data protection challenges. And when we say data protection challenges, we're focusing on the technical challenges. So you're going to understand the governance requirements, the regulatory frameworks that apply to your organisation. We're interested in what that looks like in terms of technical challenges and solutions. And we're focusing here on unstructured data. So that's files and emails. And we're looking primarily at how you can govern and protect those files and emails within Microsoft 365. So there is an assumption that your emails are in Exchange Online and that your files are in OneDrive for Business or SharePoint, or you are at least on a journey towards that point. So a lot of the tools we're going to look at do have capabilities that extend beyond Microsoft 365, but they really are aimed at organizations who are invested in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So we'll look at what you get with various different Microsoft 365 license levels, and we'll leave time for some Q&A at the end. We will be keeping this very high level. So we love to get down in the technical weeds on this stuff, but there's an awful lot to get through today. So this isn't really the forum for a deep dive. So the tools we're covering today fall into two areas. So Microsoft Purview contains most of the broad solutions we're going to be talking about, and it gives you sort of core capabilities at the Microsoft 365 E3 or Business Premium level, and some advanced capabilities at the E5 licensing level. We've also got Microsoft Priva that gives us some more specialized add-ons targeted at handling some specific privacy challenges. And we've come up with a way of visualizing this using a radial diagram. So our inner ring shows the data protection challenges. The next ring out shows the solutions that are available if you're using Microsoft 365 E3 or Business Premium licenses. The next ring out again shows the solutions available at the E5 license level. And finally, these blocks on the outer ring show where add-ons have a role to play. So this diagram, it's inevitably a simplification. So in reality, there's far more crossover between all of these solutions and their roles, but it hopefully gives you an idea of starting points. So when you're looking to solve specific information challenges, these are good places to start. Don't worry if you can't see all of the detail in the diagram on the screen as it is now. We'll zoom into various component parts as we go, and we'll give you a link to the infographic at the end as well. So these are the data protection challenges we'll be working through today. So let's jump into the first one. So classifying and protecting information based on its sensitivity. We've got two challenges here. One is implementing data classification. So for example, if you were going for ISO 27001 accreditation, this is one of the requirements you'd be looking at. And the other side of this is encrypting and protecting sensitive information. So we've grouped these two together because the solution is the same, which is to create and deploy sensitivity labels. These are part of Microsoft Purview information protection. If you've been around for a while, this was previously known as MIP, or Microsoft Information Protection. Before that, it was Azure Information Protection, so it has gone through a few renames. So let's briefly cover the technology. You create sensitivity labels to reflect broad levels of sensitivity. So these are typically things like general, internal only, and confidential. So ideally, these are going to align to a well-established information classification policy that defines handling instructions for each of your sensitivity levels. But obviously, not everyone's starting from the same place on this. You apply these labels to files and to emails, and you can do that either manually or automatically. And the labels can do various things. They can apply content marking, so headers and footers on emails and files, watermarks on Office documents. They can also apply encryption and rights management. So when we use encryption and rights management with these labels, the protection travels with the email or file. So if we set up a label that applies encryption and restricts access to members of the HR team, for example, and we apply that label to a file, that file is then protected wherever it goes. So it doesn't matter if the file's downloaded, renamed, copied, uploaded to Google Drive or Dropbox, it doesn't matter. The protection travels with the file. Whenever you try to access that file, it's going to verify your identity. And if you're not a member of the HR team, you're not going to be able to view the contents of that file. So at the E3 or the business premium license level, you get the full functionality of sensitivity labels. So you get the content marking, you get the encryption, you get the rights management, and users apply these labels manually. So when you're sending an email or saving an Office file, you're prompted to pick a label. We do usually recommend that people start with manual labeling regardless, because if users are having to manually apply these labels to files and to emails, you're building their awareness. They're going to gain awareness of your classification policy. They're going to start thinking about sensitivity, start thinking about handling sensitive information. At the E5 license level, this brings in automatic labeling. So there are two ways to do this. You can do it with pattern matching approaches. The technical term is sensitive information types. And these are aimed at sensitive information that takes predictable formats. So things like credit card numbers or national insurance numbers, anything that follows a predictable pattern. You've also got machine learning based approaches, so something called trainable classifiers, that are useful for sensitive information in less predictable formats. Just a note on that automatic labeling, there are two ways of doing it. You can do it on the client side. So client side automatic labeling happens as you're sending an email or as you're saving a file. And as well as applying labels automatically, you can recommend a particular label to a user. So for example, if your policy is detecting financial information in an email, it can recommend to the user, hey, it looks like you're adding financial information. We recommend that you apply this confidential label. So that can be a really useful way of nudging users towards a particular classification. The server side automatic labeling happens in the background, and you can set this up to trawl your content in Microsoft 365 and classify any unlabeled content based on the same approaches. So this gives you a really scalable way of labeling your data at rest. Okay, so the next area is all about how you manage sensitive data risks, and in particular, how you stop users from sharing sensitive information inappropriately. So that's typically people who are outside your organization. It could also be between different areas of your organization as well. So the primary tool here is data loss prevention, or DLP. And there is also more specific specialized support for managing privacy risks from Microsoft Priva. So if we take a quick look at DLP, first of all, this is about creating policies that detect when sensitive information is being shared inappropriately. So it's essentially a safety net. And at a very high level, there are three elements to this. So first, every DLP policy is going to have a scope. So that's where you want this policy to watch for potential problems. So it could be specific SharePoint sites, it could be specific devices, it could be teams and so on. Once you've set your scope, we're going to configure rules and conditions to detect sensitive content. So there are a few options for doing that. So we've covered pattern matching and machine learning a couple of minutes ago when we were looking at sensitivity labels. We've got a couple of other approaches here. We've got document fingerprinting, which is about looking for files that were created from a specific template. So if you've got an Office template for, let's say, a purchase order or a statement of work, whenever that template's used, any files created from that template are going to have a kind of a signature. They're going to contain the same structure, a lot of the same boilerplate text, and document fingerprinting is about detecting those kind of scenarios. You've also got something called exact data match. So this is about detecting when information from databases is shared in unstructured data in files and emails. So let's say if you're a non-profit, you might be maintaining membership data in CRM. So you've got some sensitive data sat there in CRM. You know that data needs to be protected, needs to be managed in a particular way. If that same data starts showing up in files and emails, you've got a potential indication there that that data is being shared inappropriately, and you can put DLP policies in place to deal with that. So exact data match is a really useful capability for those kind of scenarios. So finally, when we've detected a match, we're going to want to apply some remedial actions, and these range in impact from anything from simply logging an event, an audit event, through sending alerts, to showing policy tips to nudge the user in a particular direction, to blocking that activity altogether. The privacy risk management capability from Priva is kind of a more targeted and more structured version of the same thing. And this is about detecting three broad categories of a privacy issue. So data overexposure, data transfer, and aged personal data. So data overexposure policies, this is looking for personal data that's shared in potentially inappropriate ways. So if you've got a bunch of SharePoint data in a SharePoint site and that data is shared using anyone links that grant anyone with the link access to the data, that's pretty much guaranteed to be inappropriate for data with any kind of sensitivity. Data transfer is about looking for personal data being sent either outside your organization or between different units of your organization. And aged personal data, this is looking at sensitive data that hasn't been modified for a certain length of time. The default is 30 days. You can customize that to work over longer periods if you want to. So the technical term there is data minimization. You're looking to minimize the amount of data you're storing that's sensitive, and ensuring that you're not storing that data for longer than you absolutely need to. So privacy risk management gives us a really structured process for dealing with this, a triage process where you can notify users, apply labels, make the content private, delete it altogether. But it's a triage process. Basically, you'll have a list of alerts that your team can work through and take action on. So in terms of what you get at each license level, at the E3 or the business premium license level, you get the core DLP solution. So this is scoped to content in SharePoint Online, in OneDrive for Business, and Exchange Online. Bear in mind that SharePoint Online actually underpins pretty much all of your file storage within Microsoft 365. So if you're storing files in Teams, for example, or in Viva Engage, they're actually sat in SharePoint Online behind the scenes, so this will protect your data there. And in terms of the detection capabilities, we've got the basic pattern matching approach available to us. When we step up to the E5 license level, we get the more advanced DLP solution. So this gives us more scopes, so we can look at Teams chats, we can look at Power BI, we can look at on-premises file shares, legacy versions of SharePoint Server, we can look at endpoints, so managed Windows, Mac OS devices, and cloud apps. And we can use those more sophisticated detection capabilities as well. So our trainable classifiers, our document fingerprints, and our exact data match. Finally, we've got the add-ons. So Priva Privacy Risk Management is sold as an add-on. So regardless of your M365 license level, you can purchase Privacy Risk Management on a per user per month basis if you want to. The basic benefits over DLP, it gives us some predefined policies, very easy to get up and running quickly, and it gives us that very structured review process as well. Okay, so our next challenge is locating sensitive information. So understanding what sensitive information you're storing and where you're storing it. This can be particularly challenging if you've got things like unstructured file shares where no one's quite sure who owns what. You do have more options here once you get your data into Microsoft 365, so under that Microsoft 365 umbrella. So for data at rest, to file and email storage, you've got a few options like Content Explorer, Content Search, Purview eDiscovery, and we'll touch briefly on each of those. And for data in transit, so when your sensitive information is moving, we've got DLP, which we've covered already. So let's look at Content Explorer first of all. This gives us a breakdown of where the sensitive data is right across your tenancy. So we can explore this by drilling down in various ways, either by sensitivity label, by retention label, which we'll cover later, by sensitive information types, or by trainable classifier. So the screenshot you can see on the slide over on the right, this shows us a breakdown of content that matches the finance trainable classifier. So this is a classifier that's provided out of the box by Microsoft. So we're drilling down first by workload and looking at SharePoint, and we can see here exactly which SharePoint sites contain content that matches this classifier. So it's quite reassuring in this case that most of our content that's been flagged as finance is in finance-related SharePoint sites. So generally, Content Explorer is a really useful tool for identifying where you're storing sensitive content if you've already got some classification going on. So we do need to get started with some sort of classification in order to get value out of this. Content search is a little bit more focused. So again, this is about looking for sensitive content within Microsoft 365. So this could be across your Exchange online mailboxes, your OneDrive for Business sites, your SharePoint sites, and you can look for content in a variety of ways. So you can look for content based on keywords, specific properties of files or emails, authors, recipients, retention labels, lots of different ways of identifying the kind of content you're looking for here. So it's very useful for broad searches across your tenant in a more focused way than Content Explorer. Finally, we've got e-discovery. So this is very much more focused again. So this is about locating very specific information, again, right across your tenancy. So it's typically aimed at investigations. It could be legal issues, it could be data subject requests. And there's a high level process that it takes you through where you create a case, you run searches using various different criteria to find sensitive information. You put holds in place if you need to preserve that information to make sure it's not deleted or modified while your investigation goes on. And finally, you can export that content if you need to. So in terms of licensing, at the E3 or Business Premium level, we get the Content Explorer functionality and we get the content search functionality. We also get a standard version of e-discovery for locating the precise content. At the E5 level, we get a very much improved workflow for e-discovery. So far more sophisticated tools for working through the content we've identified, redacting it, reducing duplication, and so on. We also gain the ability to locate sensitive content on devices using endpoint DLP. And we can also start looking for sensitive content in on-premises repositories. So file shares, legacy SharePoint servers, using the DLP on-premises scanner. Okay, excuse me just 1 second. Right, so our next challenge is all about managing internal data risks. So this is typically things like intentional data theft, inadvertent data leaks, or other risky behavior. And the solution we use here is Purview Insider Risk Management. So Insider Risk Management is a platform that draws on a whole bunch of different Microsoft security and compliance tools. It brings them together to give you something really powerful. It's built around signals that are referred to as policy indicators. And these policy indicators can include a whole range of different user activities. It could include things like deleting files on SharePoint, copying files to a portable drive on your laptop, using your access card to get into a server room, a whole range of different signals. And it's one of those areas that draws on multiple other technologies. So if you've onboarded devices for compliance, you can collect indicators for things like copying files to USBs or printing files. If you've deployed Defender for Endpoint, you can collect indicators for things like installing malicious software. If you've set up Defender for cloud apps, you can collect indicators for unusual activity on third-party platforms like Box.com and Dropbox, and so on. So it's one of those platforms where the further you are in your sort of journey of Microsoft 365 adoption, the more value you're going to get out of this. You can also use data connectors to pull in data from various line of business apps as well. So for example, you could integrate your physical access management system. So you get alerts when people use swipe cards. You could also connect your HR system, so you get alerts on HR events, for example, when someone hands in their notice. Broadly speaking, insider risk management is about looking at correlation between these signals. So any one signal in isolation might be meaningless, but when several signals occur at the same time, it might be indicative of a problem. So the usual example here is, let's say you've got an employee who's handed in their notice and they're downloading an unusual number of files from SharePoint. So in isolation, those two events are generally pretty meaningless from a risk perspective. But when they handle together, it's an indication of a possible data risk. So insider risk management gives us a nicely triaged process for working through these alerts and quickly flagging whether they're false positives, whether they can safely be ignored, or whether they need to be looked at more closely. So as you might expect for a tool that relies on really a great deal of sophistication in terms of your Microsoft Cloud adoption, this is an E5 licensing level capability. You can also get the functionality through add-ons if you want to. So if you are using E3, for example, you can get insider risk management capabilities through the E5 compliance add-on or through the E5 insider risk management add-on. Okay, so our next challenge is governing access to SharePoint sites and to Microsoft Teams and to any other group-based workspaces that you're using in Microsoft 365. So organizations take a range of different approaches to doing this. So some organizations do this by taking a one-size-fits-all approach. So you lock everything down. That obviously hampers productivity and collaboration. It does make things more secure, but it comes at a price. So other organizations take a site-by-site or a team-by-team approach, which obviously gives you more flexibility, but it can be incredibly unwieldy, incredibly labor-intensive to manage, and in a lot of non-profits, you're not going to have the bandwidth to do that. So we're really looking for a happy medium solution here. And one solution for doing that is to use sensitivity labels. So as well as configuring sensitivity labels to classify and protect files and emails, you can also configure them to classify and protect sites and teams. So the idea is that the content owners choose a classification when you're creating a site or setting up a Microsoft team, and the policy is going to do the rest. So those capabilities that these labels apply, you can manage the privacy options. So if you're creating a team, you can manage whether it's public or private. You can control the external sharing options. So a quick example here, if you're creating a team and labeling it general, you might allow the content owners to invite external collaborators into the team. If you're labeling it as highly sensitive, you're probably going to want to lock it down so that the team owners can't bring in external users. You can also manage access from unmanaged devices. So similar example again, if it's a low sensitivity team, you might allow users to access it from any device, from a personal device. If it's highly sensitive content, you might restrict it so that they have to access it from a managed device, so a device that's enrolled in Intune and looked after by your organization. So various benefits for doing this. It's more nuanced than tenant-wide controls, but far less overhead than managing each site or team specifically. You're empowering end users. You're relying on the content owners to classify their content appropriately, but then your policy is doing the rest. All of this functionality is available at the E3 and the Business Premium license level. It's worth noting, though, that if you do set up a policy that relies on conditional access, you will also need Entra P1 Premium licenses to do that. So if you are using Business Premium or Microsoft 365 E3 rather than Office 365 E3, you will get Entra P1 Premium licenses already as part of that subscription, but obviously the licensing can be a minefield. Okay, so moving on, our next broad problem area is data investigations. So there are two main types of investigation we're going to look at here. So one is subject access requests or data subject requests. There's obviously various terms for the same thing. And the other element is information discovery to support legal investigations or internal investigations. And we've got a couple of solutions here. We've got the standard and advanced versions of eDiscovery, and we've got the more targeted previous solution, which is subject rights requests. So we've covered eDiscovery briefly already. If we look at subject rights requests, this gives us a really structured process for working through when you receive a subject access request, a subject rights request, a data subject request, or whatever you call them. It takes you through a process where you can estimate the volume of data that's going to meet your query, gather all that data, work through a review process, get approval. Approval is particularly important if the request is right to be forgotten, the request to delete data. You can generate reports, complete the process, and then close the request. So it's really giving you an end-to-end process for streamlining and working through that request. It gives you some sophisticated review capabilities along the way. So it gives you some advanced filtering capabilities to reduce the volume of data that you're dealing with. It gives you the ability to redact sensitive information, because obviously if you're providing information to one party, you can't expose data relating to another party at the same time. And it gives you some tools for managing retention conflicts if you're trying to delete something that's protected by a retention policy, and tools for deduplication as well. So eDiscovery, as we covered earlier, you get the standard version at the E3 or the business premium license level. In terms of scope, it is complete. It does cover everywhere you can store data in Microsoft 365. It also gives you the ability to use holds and exports where you need to. The premium version of eDiscovery, the scope is the same. It's just giving you more sophisticated tools for analysing and managing that content and managing what we call custodians, so the people who own that data as well. Finally, add-ons. Previous subject rights request is provided as an add-on. It gives you that guided end-to-end workflow, and this is provided on a pay-as-you-go process. You can purchase these in packs of, I believe it's 1, 10 or 100. So literally you buy them as you need them, and use them when you need to. Okay, moving on. Our penultimate area is managing communications. So communications, we're looking at a range of channels here. It could be email, it could be chat and Teams, it could be third-party messaging applications. And you might want to do this for a range of reasons. You might want to be alerted to potential bullying, potential harassment. You might need to enforce specific regulatory restrictions on which areas of an organisation are allowed to interact with other areas. And we've got two tools for doing this. We've got some communication compliance and information barriers. So if we look at some communications compliance, first of all, so this is really aimed at detecting inappropriate communication. So it could be bullying or harassment, it could be sharing of sensitive information, it could be conflicts of interest. And it's looking at that communication between specific groups of people. It's reasonably sophisticated. You can include OCR, so optical character recognition, capabilities here to pull in text from images or GIFs as well. And we can do this in a range of ways. So Microsoft give us a range of built-in classifiers to detect things like profanity, threats, targeted harassment, and so on. So it's easy to get up and running quite quickly with communication compliance. So in terms of coverage, Communications compliance covers email, it covers Teams chat, it covers Viva Engage, posts and messages. It also covers interactions with Copilot. You can also look at communications over third-party platforms. This requires you to set up connectors and basically pull in the data from those third-party platforms into Microsoft 365. In terms of the process, it gives you a really nicely structured triage process where you work through each alert in turn, you review it, you escalate it if necessary, and you can send out pre-configured notices or set up custom workflows to take additional action as you need to. The other tool here tends to be less relevant to non-profits. It's more typically relevant to highly regulated industries, particularly finance. Information barriers. This is about setting up simple blocks on communications between different areas of your organization. So you divide your organization up into segments using a fairly broad range of exchange attributes. There's almost always a way of dividing people up in the way you want. And you're basically either allowing or blocking communication between those sets of users. So it's really a fairly basic, blunt tool. There's no nuance here. It's really aimed at those regulatory scenarios where you're obliged to stop or take steps to restrict communication between specific sets of users. If you do need more nuance, such as the ability to monitor communications between two sets of users only when specific types of information come up, then you'd be looking at the communication compliance capabilities that we just covered, rather than information barriers. This is primarily aimed at communication over Teams. You can opt in SharePoint and OneDrive as well. It doesn't cover email. So if you want to block email between different areas of your organization, you'd be looking at other tools, typically transport rules, to do that instead. In terms of licensing requirements, both of these tools, the communication compliance and information barriers, are E5 licensing level tools only. So if you don't want to go the whole hog and invest in E5 licenses, you can get these tools through add-ons. So the E5 compliance add-on and the E5 insider risk management add-on both include both of these tools. Okay, our final challenge for today is probably one of the most important, and it's all about lifecycle management. So this covers quite a few different scenarios. For example, how can you protect information from deletion while you're obliged to keep it? You're going to have some content you're obliged to keep for X number of years. How do you make sure that happens? How do you stop it being deleted accidentally? It might be, how can you preserve information to meet records keeping requirements? It could also be, how can you ensure information is deleted when you're obliged to remove it? So that's obviously particularly relevant for HR teams. It's a challenge for every type of organization in every sector. HR data, you're obviously obliged to delete certain types of data after a certain length of time. How do you make sure that happens? We've got a couple of solutions, quite closely related solutions for doing lifecycle management. We've got Purview Data Lifecycle Management and Purview Records Management. So data lifecycle management is all about managing how long information is kept, and you do that by labeling it either manually or automatically. The scope here is information within Microsoft 365. So we're looking at data within SharePoint Online and Teams by extension, within OneDrive for Business and within Exchange Online to your emails as well. So we create those retention labels to reflect different types of content. So it could be things like invoices, complaints, risk assessments, CVs or resumes. We associate controls with those labels, and the control could be to either protect the content from deletion, to delete it automatically after a certain length of time, or to do both, to keep it for a certain length of time and then delete it automatically. And we can apply those labels either manually, by setting defaults on particular locations, so defaults on SharePoint libraries, or automatically using some of the tools that we looked at earlier. So records management, it uses the same fundamental building blocks as data lifecycle management. So it's built on retention labels, and you can use the two solutions independently. So if you create retention labels in data lifecycle management, they will show up in records management as well. Records management basically gives us some more robust capabilities with these labels. So we've got things like disposition reviews. So this means that when a file reaches the end of its retention period, rather than simply removing the protection or deleting it automatically, we could trigger a review process. And the reviewer can then do various things. They might permanently delete the content, they might extend the retention period, run a workflow, or remove the protection. Event-driven retention means that you trigger a retention period in response to an event. So for example, it might be when you have an employee leave your organization, you trigger a retention policy that means all records relating to that employee are automatically deleted in 3 years' time. And finally, file plans are really just a more sophisticated way of managing labels and classification. And again, they're useful if you work in a highly regulated environment. You can essentially export your labels to a spreadsheet, work through it with stakeholders, and pull it back into to Microsoft 365. In terms of the functionality and licensing here, the E3 or Business Premium licenses get you the Data Lifecycle Management solution. So this gives you manual retention labels. So you publish retention labels to particular locations, users apply them manually to files or to emails. You can also set default retention labels on SharePoint libraries and folders as well. For example, if you work in an HR team and you've got a folder in your mailbox for CVs, we could set up a default label on that folder so that everything you drop into that folder is automatically labeled as a CV and deleted in 6 months' time. The E5 license level gives us the records management solution, and it really brings in those more sophisticated capabilities. So it gives us the ability to apply these labels automatically, and it gives us those more capable mechanisms for applying labels we talked about. So disposition reviews, event-driven retention, and file plans. So there you have it. So I think, as we said at the start, this is somewhat of a simplification. There's an awful lot of crossover and interaction between these solutions we've mentioned. You probably got a feel for that when you saw things like trainable classifiers and sensitive information types come up time and time again with different solutions. Hopefully what this does give you is some idea of where to start. So what you can do within your license levels and where to start with some of these common data protection and governance challenges. We've got a couple of next steps, so some resources here that might be useful to you. So we'll share the slides as a PDF after the webinar. And at that point, I think we can move on to any questions.
Amazing, thanks, Jason. Yes, we have got a few questions in the Q&A. If anyone has any, feel free to pop them in, because we've got enough time to answer them. First one, so how do you recommend coming up with the best sensitivity labels?
So if you were starting completely from scratch, I guess, so complete blank page. So you need to come up with an information classification policy, first of all. So the paper policy has to lead the technical controls. And the way we typically do this, you need to engage with stakeholders around your organisation and identify the types of sensitive content they're storing. So if you engage with an HR team, for example, they might identify CVs and resumes, cover letters, any kind of documentation relating to employment. If you engage with a finance team, they might identify financial statements, invoices, purchase orders, and so on. So you're going to engage with different areas of your organization and start identifying what types of content they're looking to manage. You're then looking to group them. You're looking to come up with probably 3 or 4 categories. Think of them as buckets that you're going to drop these different types of content into based on how they need to be handled. So you might start with something like general, internal only, confidential. And you see how this fits. You see how those types of sensitive information you've identified fit into those buckets. And you test it as well. So as you engage with more and more parts of your organization, you're going to find types of content that don't fit neatly into these buckets. So you refine it as necessary. So for example, at Chorus, we started, I think, with public, general and confidential. We quickly found we needed to introduce internal only and limited to cater for some of those types of content that we hadn't originally considered. So it's really going through that exercise of understanding what type of content you're managing and then trying to group it into some intuitive classifications and then really testing that, refining it as necessary, building up that policy, defining some handling instructions that specify how you expect your users to treat information that fits into these different categories and so on. So it will be a process of whiteboarding, testing, refining, and really building up that paper-based policy.
Amazing, thank you. Got a good one here. Where would you recommend starting?
Okay, so again, I guess if we're starting with a complete blank slate, you're not doing anything data protection and governance related. I think the big 3 in data protection are lifecycle management. So reducing data risk by making sure you're not hanging on to content for any longer than you need to. So any bit of content you're hanging on to, every piece of content is a data risk. If you were breached, would you want that content exposed to only keep stuff for as long as you absolutely need to? Classification's usually one of the big 3 as well. And DLP gives us a useful safety net. I think probably more fundamentally though, get data into Microsoft 365. If you're paying for Microsoft 365, you're paying for SharePoint Online, get content out of those legacy file shares, get it into SharePoint Online. You're immediately unlocking more sophisticated capabilities for understanding what you're dealing with and putting controls in place. So really do that first. Consolidate your data into Microsoft 365.
Amazing. Very topical one. What challenges does Copilot introduce, and how would you tackle these challenges?
Okay, so Copilot, if we're looking at Copilot for Microsoft 365, so Copilot for Microsoft 365 uses something called the Microsoft Graph, which is like an API layer that gives you access to all of your data. So Microsoft Graph joins the dots between the people you work with, the files you upload, the meetings you attend, the content you share with each other, the Teams chats you have with each other, and so on. If you imagine everything you do in Microsoft 365 to interact with your colleagues and share information and manage information, you can kind of draw dots between them. So Copilot leverages Microsoft Graph to give you answers based on all of that data. So Microsoft Graph will never expose data that you don't have access to. So everything is security trimmed. Everything respects your security. It respects your access management. You're only going to see answers from Copilot on content that you have access to. What it may do, though, is expose content you have access to that you perhaps shouldn't have access to. So if there are big holes in your access management, you'll have exactly the same issue with search in SharePoint. There is the possibility that it will expose areas of content that you perhaps wouldn't want to be more widely shared. So Microsoft's recommendations here actually largely align with the data protection capabilities we've talked about. So first of all, get your access management right, get your SharePoint, your information architecture right, organize things based on who owns the information, who needs access to what, how sensitive your data is. It will be much easier to manage. Then start introducing those data protection capabilities. So lifecycle management. If you're storing 4 different versions of your HR policies and you ask Copilot a question about your HR policies, it's not going to be able to give you a coherent answer. So get that lifecycle management in place, delete the stuff that's redundant, out of date, no longer useful, and you're going to get sharper answers from Copilot, as well as reducing the risk that it exposes things that you shouldn't necessarily see. If you introduce data classification, Copilot will respect that. So if you've got classification labels, sensitivity labels that apply rights management, and that rights management doesn't give you the right to extract content from a file, then Copilot's not going to help you with that. Copilot is not going to pull content from that file when you're working. Also, if you ask Copilot to generate a file for you, if you ask Copilot to draft you content based on some other content in your tenancy, it will respect the classification of that existing content. So it will pull through the label and automatically label and protect the content that it generates. And finally, you've got DLP, which gives you that safety net. So you can use DLP to identify where sensitive content is overexposed and lock it down, so you're reducing the risk that it's overexposed through Copilot. So I appreciate that's quite a lot of things. Copilot's probably a topic for an entire webinar in its own right, but it's the fundamental principles that we talked through today really apply to Copilot as well.
Amazing, thanks, Jason. Probably good plug. We actually have a Copilot for Microsoft 365 webinar next week. I'll include it in the resources. No other questions, but I just had one that I've asked in previous webinars that's quite good, which is, Jason, what is your feature or tool that you find is commonly underutilized but delivers the most value, in your opinion?
From all of these data protection and governance tools, I really like the classification of sites and teams, because it's so often overlooked. It's so simple to set up. The impact on users, there's sort of very little learning curve. It's intuitive, and it's reducing the headaches for IT as well. You're reducing the need to sort of granularly manage every individual site and team. You're letting the people who own the content, understand their content, actually get on and work. You're treating them as grown-ups and allowing them to classify the content, and you're putting the tools in place to support that and protect them.
Love it. Amazing. I think we'll wrap up there. As I mentioned, I'll send an email to everyone with the resources, slides, infographic, and any relevant links. Please, if you've got any questions we didn't answer during this, just respond to that, and then I can get Jason to give you a response to it. So yeah, thank you very much, Jason. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks very much, everyone.